Hi, I'm going to be talking about gross motor skills using your legs. So there are 4 main gross motor actions we do with our legs, and they are flexion, extension, lateral rotation, and medial rotation. So there's also movements with your feet, which we're not going to discuss in this portion, but will be covered at some point in this presentation. So we're going to start with flexion. So flexion occurs both at your knee and at your hip, and it is when you bend that part of your leg, either your knee or your hip, so that your leg goes behind you or backwards. There's also extension, which is the inverse of flexion, and it's when it occurs at your knee or your hip, and it's when you bend them so that your leg goes forward. So you can think of these 2 motions as if you were going to kick a ball. As the ball is coming towards you, you're going to move your leg behind your body to get more force for when you kick it. So when it's behind your body, when your knee is behind you, leg is ready to go, that is flexion. As you kick it and you make contact with the ball and your leg goes forward and you follow through, that's extension because you're extending it out. So there's flexion and extension. These both take place, like I said, at the knee or the hip, which the knee is a hinge joint. So this uses a hinge motion both at the knee and the hip, but the knee specifically is a hinge joint. So think like a door hinge, how it opens and closes at a 90-degree angle and can go, out and in. So that is what your knee and your hip are doing during this motion. There are also lateral and medial rotations, which occur at your hip only. So lateral rotation at your hip is when you twist your leg at your hip going outward. So a way to think of it as going outward is the inner part of your foot, the inner side of your foot, is going to be facing in front of you more. If you know anything about ballet, first position, when you have your feet out like that, uses lateral rotation. Another way to think of it is if someone is using their feet and you say they're walking like a duck because their feet are pointed out, that would be lateral rotation at your hip. Another way to think of it, if you can't visualize it, is having your heels touching each other and your feet facing out with your heels touching. Lateral rotation. There's also medial rotation, which occurs at your hip also, and it's the inverse of lateral rotation. So it's when you twist your leg so that it goes and the inner part of your foot is facing in. So this would be like having it so you're twisting your leg so that your toes are touching each other as opposed to your heels touching each other with lateral rotation. These 2 rotations in your hip use the ball and socket of your hip. So that's the kind of joint you have there, ball and socket joint. And at your knee, you have the hinge joint. So the ball and socket joint is a little more flexible than the hinge joint because ball and socket it can flex and extend, but it can also rotate, and you can use it for abduction and adduction and so on. So it's got a lot more movements capabilities because it's something called multi-axial, so multiple axles, as opposed to a hinge joint, which is uniaxial. So the hinge joint, even though they can't do as much as a ball and socket joint, those motions with your leg are a lot more functional. And they're more functional because you use flexion and extension to kick things, you use them to step, you use them to jump, use them to hop and skip. More of those ways we transport ourselves with our legs.